When they first met, it was like something out of a dream. They were both young, full of hope and energy, and everything seemed to fall into place effortlessly. She was drawn to his strength, his easy smile, and the way he carried himself with so much confidence. He, on the other hand, couldn't help but admire her beauty and the warmth she brought to every room she entered. Together, they made a perfect match. They spent hours talking, laughing, and dreaming about the future. Their connection was instant, and their love grew quickly. It wasn't long before they decided to marry. Despite being young, they felt like they were ready to take on the world together. Their family and friends were thrilled about their decision, believing they had something special. As they started their married life, things seemed to fall into place. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. They moved into a small apartment, decorated it with love, and filled it with plans for their future. Even though money was tight, they made do. There was a sense of comfort in the small moments, sharing simple meals, holding hands, and whispering about their dreams for what lay ahead. Then came their first child, and their joy multiplied. The day they brought their baby home was one of the happiest moments of their lives. The little one was the perfect addition to their little family, and they both couldn't wait to see what the future held for them as parents. Over the next few years, they had more children, 5 in total, and their home became a busy place full of laughter, cries, and the occasional chaos that comes with raising a big family. Despite the challenges of raising 5 kids, they did it with love. Each child was special, and together they made a family that felt complete. The husband took pride in his role as the protector and provider. He worked long hours, sometimes taking on extra jobs to make sure there was enough for everyone. The wife, too, poured her heart into caring for the kids, making their home a place where everyone felt safe and loved. But as the years went on, things started to change. Life, with all its responsibilities, began to weigh heavily on their shoulders. The stress of raising a large family and keeping up with the demands of everyday life took its toll. What once seemed like a perfect partnership began to feel like a burden. The couple found themselves arguing more often. Small disagreements grew into bigger ones, and slowly the distance between them started to grow. They had always been able to talk through their problems in the past, but now the words didn't come as easily. The wife felt overwhelmed by the constant pressures of motherhood and the lack of support. The husband, though he tried his best, couldn't seem to understand what she was going through. Both of them were exhausted, physically and emotionally. They had become so caught up in the demands of their family and daily life that they forgot to take care of each other. One evening, after another difficult conversation, the wife sat quietly, staring out the window, unsure of what to do next. She loved her family, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She wondered if there was more to life than the daily routine they had fallen into. Little did she know, this feeling would lead to a decision that would change everything. As the days turned into months, the cracks in their relationship became harder to ignore. The arguments that once seemed like small disagreements were now growing larger, and the silence between them seemed heavier. She started to feel as though something inside her had changed. She was no longer the young woman who had once been full of dreams and excitement. The weight of raising 5 children, managing the house, and trying to keep everything running smoothly had drained her. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, it was the emotional toll. She would wake up early in the morning, preparing breakfast for the kids, making sure they had everything they needed for school, and then spending the rest of the day running around to meet their needs. But no matter how hard she tried, she always felt like she was falling short. The house was never clean enough, the kids were never quiet enough, and there never seemed to be enough time for herself. Each day felt like a repeat of the one before, and slowly she began to resent the life she had worked so hard to build. Meanwhile, her husband was also struggling, though in his own way. He worked tirelessly to support the family, taking on extra shifts at work and doing what he could to ensure the bills were paid. But even with all his efforts, he felt disconnected from his wife. He had noticed the change in her, the way she seemed to pull away from him. He would try to reach out, but she was always too tired or too caught up in her responsibilities to notice. His own frustration began to build. He loved his family deeply, but he was unsure how to fix what seemed so broken between them. One night, after another argument, the wife sat alone in their bedroom, staring at the wall. She had been trying to make things work for so long, but now she couldn't help but wonder if it was time to give up. The thought had crossed her mind before, but she had always pushed it aside. Now it felt like a real possibility. She loved her children, but she couldn't help but feel that her life was slipping away. The dreams she had once held for herself seemed impossible now. She thought about all the sacrifices she had made, and yet she still felt unfulfilled. She spoke to a few friends, confiding in them about her feelings, and some of them suggested that she needed a break. "Maybe you need to spend some time away," one friend suggested. "You've given so much, and maybe it's time for you to take care of yourself for a change." The idea lingered in her mind, and for the first time in a long time, she thought about what it would feel like to live for herself, even if just for a while. After much thought, she made a decision. She would leave. It wasn't a decision she made lightly, and the guilt of it weighed heavily on her. She thought about the kids, how they would feel, how her husband would react. But deep down, she knew she needed to find herself again. She couldn't keep going on like this, feeling lost and alone in the life she had created. So, with a heavy heart, she packed a few things and left. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she hoped that this time apart would bring her the clarity she so desperately needed. As she walked out the door, she took one last look at her family. Her children asleep, her husband unaware of the storm brewing, and for the first time in years, she felt a mixture of fear and relief. She didn't know what was next, but she knew she couldn't stay. The days following her departure were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. The husband couldn't quite understand what had just happened. One moment, everything felt as though it was falling apart, and the next, she was gone. He had always known there were problems in their marriage, but he had never imagined it would come to this. He had always tried to keep the family together, to provide and protect, but he felt powerless now. At first, he was numb. He walked around the house in a daze, not sure what to do next. The sound of silence in the house was overwhelming. There was no one to share the burden with, no one to talk to at the end of a long day. It wasn't just the empty space she left behind. It was the sense of loss. He missed her in ways he didn't expect. Her laugh, the way she would always remind him to slow down, and the comfort of knowing she was there. Now, it felt like something vital had been taken from him, but there was no time for self-pity. He had 5 kids to take care of. He had always promised himself that no matter what happened in his marriage, he would never let his children feel neglected. They were his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they were okay. He threw himself into the task of taking care of them, learning how to juggle everything on his own. The first few days were the hardest. The kids noticed the difference right away. They missed their mom, of course, but they didn't fully understand what was happening. The youngest ones, still too small to grasp the situation, asked about her constantly. The older children seemed sad, but they also had a quiet understanding of the change. They could see how much their father was struggling, but they also knew he was doing his best. The husband had to quickly learn how to balance his work with the responsibilities of being a single parent. He woke up early each day, making sure the kids were fed, helping them get dressed, and making sure they had everything they needed for school. At night, after a long day of work, he would help them with homework and get them ready for bed. There were many nights when he was exhausted, too tired to even think straight, but he pushed through because he had no choice. Slowly, he began to get into a rhythm. It wasn't easy, but he did his best. He found ways to make sure the kids felt loved and supported. He would tell them stories at night, play games with them on weekends, and listen to their problems, even when he had his own worries. Though he was still heartbroken, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. His children needed him, and that's all that mattered. It wasn't long before his friends and family started noticing the changes in him. They were proud of how he was handling everything, but they could see the toll it was taking. He had become more withdrawn, more focused on his responsibilities than on his own well-being. But even though he was putting on a brave face, the loneliness still crept in. He missed his wife, but he also began to question the decisions she had made. Why had she left? What was she really searching for? The questions swirled in his mind, but he couldn't afford to dwell on them for long. His children needed him to stay strong, and so he did. He kept going, day after day, always pushing forward, trying to make the best of a difficult situation. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't let his children see him fall apart. He would do whatever it took to make sure they had everything they needed, no matter the cost to himself. The years after she left were a blur for both of them. For her, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one that she hoped would bring her the peace and fulfillment she had been longing for. But at the same time, there was always a nagging feeling that she couldn't shake, the thought of her children, of the family she had walked away from. At first, she convinced herself that her decision was the right one. She had needed space to grow, to find herself again. She couldn't continue living the way she had been, stuck in a routine that made her feel lost. She moved to a new city, hoping that a fresh start would help her figure out what she truly wanted. She found a small apartment, far away from the life she had left behind. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what she thought she needed. She made new friends, started a new job, and spent time exploring things she had never had the chance to focus on before. She learned new skills, traveled to new places, and began to feel like the person she had once dreamed of becoming. But as time passed, the loneliness began to creep in. The excitement of her new life eventually faded, and with it came the realization that something was missing. No matter how many new experiences she had, no matter how much she tried to fill the emptiness, it never seemed enough. The children's faces haunted her. She couldn't stop thinking about how they were doing without her. She wondered if they hated her for leaving, or if they even remembered her. Her thoughts often returned to her husband. She had left him in a moment of frustration, believing that she couldn't continue to live in the same way. But now, as the years went by, she realized how much he had changed. In the beginning, she imagined him to be lost without her, struggling to handle everything alone. But deep down, she had also hoped that he might come to understand why she needed to leave. She thought that maybe he would find someone else, move on, and be happier without her. It was a strange mix of relief and guilt, and it was hard to know how to feel about it. She occasionally checked in on the kids, sending them letters, small gifts, and the occasional phone call. But it never felt like enough. Her absence left a void, one that could never be filled with just material things or words over the phone. She began to realize that the decision to leave wasn't as simple as she had once thought. There were consequences she wasn't fully prepared for. Despite her growing sense of regret, she still didn't feel ready to go back. She was determined to continue building her life, to prove to herself that she could find happiness on her own. She started attending therapy to work through her feelings, trying to understand what had led her to make such a drastic decision. With time, she began to unpack the emotions that had been buried for so long, the frustrations, the sadness, and the longing for a life that was different from the one she had left behind. But even in the midst of her personal growth, there were moments when she couldn't escape the question of whether she had made the right choice. Was it too late to fix what she had broken? Would her children forgive her? And what about her husband? Could their relationship ever be repaired? As she faced these questions, she realized that the answers wouldn't come easily. There was no clear path forward, no simple fix. But she knew one thing for sure. She had to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how difficult that might be. As the years passed, the husband found a new sense of purpose in his life. Although the absence of his wife weighed heavily on him, he refused to let it pull him down. He threw himself into his work and the responsibilities of raising his children, determined to create a better future for them. Despite the challenges, he remained steadfast in his commitment to being there for his kids, no matter what it took. At first, he felt overwhelmed by the sudden weight of responsibility. It wasn't easy to juggle work, household chores, and the emotional needs of 5 kids. There were days when he felt completely exhausted, when the idea of doing it all on his own seemed too much to bear. But something inside him kept pushing him forward. The thought of his children, their smiles, and their need for him kept him going. He was proud of how he had managed to keep the family together. Over the years, he became more than just their father. He became their rock, their guide, and their source of strength. The kids, though they missed their mother, began to see their father in a new light. They admired his resilience and the way he was always there for them, no matter how difficult things got. The children grew older, and so did he. The bond between father and children deepened as they navigated the ups and downs of life together. The youngest learned to walk. The older ones became teenagers, and they all began to make their own decisions. Though there were difficult moments, especially as the children grew more independent, he always made sure they knew they could count on him. But his personal life had changed too. He had become someone different from the man he was before. He was more confident, more self-assured. He had learned how to balance his responsibilities and make time for himself. He had found hobbies that brought him joy, like playing basketball with his kids on weekends and taking up painting in the evenings. Slowly, he began to discover parts of himself he had forgotten about during the years of marriage. Despite his growth, there were still moments when he felt the absence of his wife. He wondered what she was doing, how her life had turned out. He imagined that she had found the happiness she was searching for when she left, but part of him still wondered if they could have made it work. The pain of their separation still lingered in the back of his mind, but he didn't let it consume him. He knew that he had to move forward, for the sake of his children and for himself. He focused on being the best father he could be. He attended school events, helped with homework, and spent as much time with his kids as possible. He was proud of how they had turned out, smart, kind, and hardworking. He saw bits of himself in them, and it made him feel like all the sacrifices had been worth it. There was also a shift in his career. As the years went by, he started getting promoted at work. His hard work paid off, and he found himself in a better financial situation than he had ever been before. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his life, and it felt good. Even with all his successes, though, he knew something was still missing. He had learned to cope with his feelings of loneliness, but deep down, he knew that his heart had never fully healed from the pain of the past. He still loved his children more than anything, but there was a part of him that wondered if he would ever find true happiness again. And as time went on, he couldn't help but think about his wife. Was there a chance for reconciliation, or had she moved on for good? He didn't have the answers yet, but he was no longer the man who had been lost and broken. He had built a new life, one that was stronger and more fulfilling than he ever could have imagined. And although the future was uncertain, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. As the years went on, the wife found herself in a place she hadn't expected. She had spent so much time trying to create a new life for herself, hoping that it would fill the emptiness she had been feeling. At first, it worked. She filled her days with activities and new experiences. She had made friends, started a new job, and even found a sense of independence that she hadn't known she needed. But slowly, things started to feel different. The busy life she had built for herself was no longer enough to mask the loneliness that had begun to creep in. There were moments when she would find herself missing the laughter of her children, the way they would run around the house full of energy. She missed the feeling of being part of a family, the warmth and connection that had once been so natural to her. Even with all the new things in her life, the absence of her children and the life she had left behind left an ache in her heart. She had tried to stay focused on her own growth, telling herself that she had made the right decision. But every time she thought of her children, it was like a reminder of the choice she had made. She had told herself that she needed to leave to find happiness. But now, It seemed like that happiness was slipping through her fingers. She hadn't expected how hard it would be to be away from them for so long. She wondered if they ever thought about her, if they missed her the way she missed them. Her thoughts often wandered back to her husband as well. She couldn't deny that there were moments when she wondered how he was doing. Was he managing okay without her? Had he found peace? She had left with the hope that he would be able to move on. But now the thought of him still haunted her. She hadn't expected to care so much after all this time. There were days when she found herself staring out the window, thinking about what could have been. What if she had stayed? What if she had tried harder to make things work? The guilt started to settle in, slowly at first, then all at once. She realized she had been running away from more than just her marriage. She had been running from herself. The truth was, she had never really taken the time to understand why she had felt so lost in the first place. She had blamed her marriage, her responsibilities, and the pressure of life. But now she saw that she had to confront her own feelings, her own fears, and her own unmet needs. It wasn't easy to admit to herself, but she knew it was time to face the truth. The life she had built for herself wasn't enough to fill the hole in her heart. She had thought that leaving would give her the answers, but it had only made her realize that the answers lay within her all along. She needed to heal, not just from the pain of her marriage, but from the deeper, unspoken struggles she had carried for years. She decided it was time to make a change. She began to take steps to rebuild the connection she had lost with her children. She started writing letters to them, sending little gifts, and asking about their lives. She wanted to be a part of their world again, to find a way back to the love they had shared. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and it might take time, but she was ready to try. She also began looking inward, seeking therapy to help her understand her feelings and begin the process of healing. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but she realized that facing the past was the only way to move forward. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing: she was ready to make things right, no matter how long it took. One evening, as the husband sat on the couch after a long day of work, he heard his phone buzz. He reached for it, expecting a message from one of his kids, but when he looked at the screen, his hands froze. It was a message from his wife. He stared at the screen for a few moments, unsure of how to feel. It had been years since they had spoken properly. Of course, there had been a few messages here and there, mostly about the kids, but this time, something felt different. Her message wasn't just about them. It was about her. She had written, "I've been thinking a lot about the past. I'd like to talk if you're willing." He wasn't sure how to respond. A part of him wanted to ignore it. He had worked hard to build a life without her, to move forward despite the pain she had left behind. But another part of him was curious. Why now? What did she want to talk about? Had she changed? For the rest of the night, he thought about it. He remembered how broken he had been when she left, how he had struggled to take care of their kids alone. But he also remembered the good times, the laughter, the dreams they had once shared. No matter how much he tried to push it away, there was still a part of him that wondered if things could have been different. The next day, after much thought, he decided to reply. He kept it simple. "Okay. When do you want to talk?" When his phone buzzed again, she responded quickly, suggesting they meet in a quiet cafe. He hesitated before agreeing. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing: he was strong now. He had built a life without her, and no matter what happened, he wouldn't let this conversation shake him. A few days later, the day of their meeting arrived. As he walked into the cafe, he felt a mixture of emotions. He was calm, yet his heart beat a little faster as he saw her sitting at a table near the window. She looked different, but there was something familiar in her eyes. She smiled nervously as he sat down. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then she took a deep breath and said, "I just want to say that I'm sorry." Her words caught him off guard. Over the years, he had imagined this moment so many times, but he had never expected her to say that. She continued, her voice filled with emotion. "I left because I thought I needed to find happiness. I thought I was missing something. But the truth is, I was running away from my own fears. I never stopped thinking about you or the kids. And now, I just want to make things right." He listened quietly, taking in every word. He could hear the regret in her voice, the pain in her eyes. But he also knew that words alone weren't enough. It wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about what came next. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," she said softly. "I just want to know if there's still a place for me in our children's lives. And maybe, if there's any chance that we can heal, even just a little." He exhaled slowly, looking at the woman who had once been his whole world. He didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain. This conversation was only the beginning. The days that followed their meeting were a mix of emotions for both of them. The wife felt a sense of relief after finally expressing her regret and asking for forgiveness. It had taken her years to build up the courage to face her past, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. She understood that saying sorry was just the first step in a long journey. The question that lingered in her mind was whether her husband and children could ever fully trust her again. Could they accept her back into their lives after everything that had happened? For the husband, the meeting had stirred up many emotions. He had always thought he was past the pain of their separation, but seeing her again had brought back a flood of memories. It was hard for him to imagine allowing her back into their lives, especially after all the years that had passed. He had worked so hard to make sure his children didn't feel the void she had left. They had grown into young adults, and he had become their guide through life. The idea of reopening old wounds and disrupting the stability they had found felt daunting. Yet, despite his doubts, he couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. There was no way to ignore the pain she had carried for so long. He had always been a man of compassion, and deep down, he understood how hard it must have been for her to leave. But he also knew that their past was not something that could be erased with words alone. Time had passed, and they had both changed in ways that couldn't be undone. The husband decided to take things slow. He knew he couldn't rush this process, and he didn't want to force his children into anything they weren't ready for. His priority was them, their well-being, and their happiness. He spoke with each of them individually, asking how they felt about the idea of reconnecting with their mother. The responses were mixed. Some of the children expressed that they were open to it, while others were more hesitant. They all had their own feelings about their mother's absence and the pain it had caused. The wife, on the other hand, focused on rebuilding the trust she had lost. She didn't expect everything to fall back into place immediately. She began spending time with the kids individually, getting to know them again. She listened to their stories, apologized for her absence, and offered them the love they had been missing for so long. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of tension, but slowly things began to improve. The children could see that she was genuinely trying to make amends, and that meant a lot to them. Over time, the family began to heal. The wife was allowed back into their lives, but it wasn't a perfect fix. Trust had to be rebuilt one step at a time, and there were moments when it felt like it might never happen. But the key was that they were trying, and that effort made all the difference. The husband and wife, although never able to fully return to the relationship they once had, found a new understanding of each other. They learned to co-parent as a team, focusing on the well-being of their children rather than their past. They had both grown, and though their paths had separated for a time, they were able to find common ground for the sake of their family. Years later, the family gathered for a special occasion. A wedding, a graduation, or just a holiday celebration. And it was clear that they had come a long way. The bond they shared was stronger than it had ever been. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they had become a part of the story of their resilience, of how they overcame pain and found their way back to each other. The husband looked around at his children, now adults, and realized that they had made it through. They had survived the hardest parts of life, and they had done it together. He couldn't change the past, but he was proud of the family they had become. In the end, that was what mattered most.